He mopped the same floors every night, invisible to the doctors who walked past him without a second glance, unknown to the nurses who handed him trash bags without looking up. For 4 years, Victor Kane existed in the background of Fort Bragg Memorial Hospital. Quiet, unhurried, unremarkable. But deep inside those walls, veterans were dying under suspicious circumstances, a conspiracy was being buried in silence, and one afternoon, a soldier's heart stopped in the emergency room, and every licensed surgeon in the building stood frozen. That was the moment they found out that the man with the mop had hands steadier than any of theirs, and a past that was about to change everything. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The hospital was quietest at 4 in the morning, not silent. Hospitals were never silent. Monitors beeped behind closed doors. Elevators hummed. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, a man with a ventilator breathed in the steady, mechanical rhythm of a machine doing the work his lungs had given up on. But at 4 in the morning, the corridors of Fort Bragg Memorial Hospital belonged to the fluorescent lights and the cleaning staff, and tonight, like every night, they belonged most of all to Victor Kane. He moved through the East Wing the way he moved through everything, without hurry, without wasted motion. The mop traced clean arcs across the linoleum. His hands, large and dark and steady, worked the handle with the kind of automatic precision that comes not from laziness but from mastery, or from doing something so many times that the body takes over and the mind is free to go elsewhere. Victor's mind at 4 in the morning went quiet. That was the only hour of the day when it did. He was 58 years old. His hair had gone silver at the temples and was working its way to silver everywhere else. There were lines in his face that hadn't been there 10 years ago, and his left knee ached in the cold, which this particular October was reminding him of regularly. He wore the blue uniform of the Fort Bragg Memorial Hospital Environmental Services Department with the same straightness he'd once worn dress greens. Not because anyone asked him to, but because he didn't know how to carry himself any other way. A nurse came around the corner, moving fast, chart tucked under her arm. She didn't look at him. Her eyes moved through him the way eyes move through furniture, registering his presence only enough to step around the wet section of floor without being told. Victor watched her go. He didn't take it personally. He had spent 4 years becoming invisible in this building, and invisibility, he had learned, had its uses. He worked his way down the corridor methodically. Room 408, 410, 412. He slowed at 412 without quite stopping. The door was cracked open 2 inches, enough to hear the monitors, enough to read the quality of a man's breathing if you knew what to listen for. Victor listened. The breathing was labored in a specific way, uneven in a pattern he recognized the way a musician recognizes a chord played slightly wrong. Not enough to alarm the overnight staff. Enough to mean something to someone who'd spent 12 years in trauma surgery and 4 more in field hospitals where you learn to read patients through walls. The man in room 412 was Corporal Dustin Reeves, 24 years old, and he was in more trouble than his chart reflected. Victor didn't go in. He wasn't a doctor. Not officially, not in this building, not in any building that mattered anymore. He was the man who mopped the floor. He moved his cart to the supply closet at the end of the hall, and from his front pocket he took a small square of paper. His hands, those large, steady hands, folded it in 4 moves, not looking down, the way a man ties a tie without a mirror. What emerged was small, clean, unmistakable. A crane. He walked back to 412, pushed the door open quietly, crossed to the nightstand, and set it down beside the water cup and the get-well card from someone named Kayla, who had signed it with 2 hearts. He stood there for a moment looking at Dustin Reeves' face. Young, jaw slack in sleep. The kind of face that still looked like a boy's face. Victor had operated on 100 faces like that in Baghdad and Kandahar and Fallujah. faces that belonged to people too young to be in the kind of trouble they were in. He went back to his mop. Victor lived in a one-bedroom apartment 12 minutes from the hospital on a street lined with oak trees that had turned orange in the October cold. The apartment was the kind of place that communicated nothing about the person who lived in it. Neutral walls, second-hand furniture, a kitchen table with 2 chairs that were never both occupied. A man living in transit, or a man who had decided that where he lived didn't matter because where he lived wasn't who he was. The walls were bare, except for one thing. On the wall beside the bathroom door hung a framed photograph, 8 inches by 10. In it, a surgical team stood outside a field hospital in Kandahar, squinting against the sun, everyone grinning with the slightly unhinged cheerfulness of people who had been working for 36 hours straight and were running entirely on adrenaline and bad coffee. In the center of the group stood a younger version of Victor, 40, maybe 41, broad-shouldered, still carrying the straight posture of a man who had spent years in uniform. He was grinning too. His arm was around a young resident who barely came up to his shoulder. The photo was hung with its back facing the wall. On the back, he held in place by a strip of tape, were 4 small rectangles of metal. A bronze star, a purple heart, a Legion of Merit, and one more. A medal most people couldn't name that was given only to surgeons who had performed exceptional work under combat conditions, given so rarely that the Army had issued fewer than 200 of them in 30 years. Victor never turned the frame around. Under his bed, pushed to the back, where you'd only find it if you were looking, was a metal box. The kind of thing a man might use to store important documents, fireproof, lockable, with a combination he hadn't dialed in 11 years. He knew what was in it. He didn't need to open it to know. Some things you kept, not because you were going to use them, but because throwing them away would mean something you weren't ready for it to mean. He made his coffee, a black, no sugar, and stood at the kitchen window watching the oak trees in the dark. Fort Bragg Memorial Hospital ran on a hierarchy as rigid as any military structure, and at the top of that hierarchy sat Dr. Nathaniel Holt. Holt was 52, lean in the way that spoke of discipline rather than nature. With silver-streaked hair he kept impeccably cut, and the kind of handshake that told you immediately where he thought he stood in relation to you. He had been chief of surgery for 9 years. In those 9 years he had published 41 papers, won 3 departmental excellence awards, and methodically, carefully assembled a surgical department that ran exactly the way he wanted it to, which was to say, a department where competence was rewarded with access and loyalty was rewarded with advancement. And the distinction between the two was never quite made explicit. His protégé was Dr. Simone Archer. Simone was 34, black, and brilliant in the way that made other people uncomfortable, not showing off, not performing, just quietly arriving at conclusions before everyone else in the room, and then waiting, with visible patience, for everyone else to catch up. She had done her residency at Johns Hopkins, turned down 2 offers from major civilian hospitals to come to Fort Bragg Memorial because she believed in the work, believed in serving military patients, believed that the people who put their bodies in front of bullets deserved the best medicine available. Holt had recruited her personally and told her in that first conversation over coffee in his office that she had a real future here, that he would make sure she had the resources and the platform to do the kind of work she was capable of. What Simone had come to understand, slowly over 2.5 years, was that Holt's idea of her future and her own were not the same thing. She had prestige, she had a title, she had access to good cases and a research budget and her name on the department letterhead. What she did not have was real autonomy, the ability to make calls without checking with Holt first, to question protocols without it being noted, to push back on decisions without finding the next interesting case quietly redirected to someone more agreeable. She was in a box, a very nicely furnished box. It was 11:15 at night and she was at the nursing station on the 2nd floor. charting a post-op case that should have been straightforward and wasn't quite, and her pen had run out of ink, and she'd reached for the nearest thing without looking. "Can you hand me that?" she said. The pen appeared at her elbow. She took it, signed the chart, and was about to look up when her pager went off. She was already moving when she registered in peripheral awareness that the pen had come from the hand of the man mopping the floor 6 feet away. She glanced back once. He was watching her go with an expression she couldn't read. Quiet, still, something in his eyes that didn't match his uniform. Then she was around the corner, and the moment was gone. Victor watched her walk away. He knew who she was. He knew who everyone was. That was one of the things about being invisible. You had time to pay attention. His neighbor was a man named Marcus Webb, 65, retired Army chaplain, a man who had spent 30 years listening to soldiers talk in the dark and had developed the capacity for silence that only comes from truly understanding its value. They played chess on Wednesday evenings. Marcus always brought the board. Victor always made the coffee. This Wednesday, Marcus set up the pieces without speaking for a while. Outside, the October wind moved the oaks. The kitchen table was between them, and the metal box was under the bed, and the photo was on the wall with its back turned. "You hear about the congressional inquiry?" Marcus said. "Heard something?" "They're sending someone to look at the hospital. Mortality rates." Marcus moved a pawn. "Word through the chaplain network is it's more than a review." Someone's asking questions that don't usually get asked out loud. Victor considered his opening. Questions about what? About why veterans keep dying post-surgery at 3 times the national average. Marcus looked at him over the board. "You know anything about that?" "I mop floors, Marcus." "You read medical journals in a supply closet at 2 in the morning. Victor moved his knight. Old habits. They played for a while. The wind moved. The coffee cooled. Then Marcus said quietly, the way he said things that mattered, "You could still fight it, Victor. What they did to you, the court-martial. Even now, there are people in the JAG Corps who—" "I know. Eleanor Voss. I know her name. She tried to reach you 3 times, different addresses. I moved. You were hiding." Victor looked at the board. He had 4 moves until checkmate, and Marcus, who was a reasonably good chess player, hadn't seen it yet. "I was surviving," Victor said. "There's a difference." Marcus studied him. "Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, survival and hiding look like the same piece." Victor moved his knight again. "Your bishop's exposed." Marcus looked at the board, sighed. "So it is." They didn't talk about the court-martial again that night, but when Marcus left, Victor sat at the kitchen table for a long time, not moving, the chess pieces still in their mid-game positions, the October wind pressing at the window, and the locked metal box exactly where it had always been. Brigadier General Diana Frost arrived at Fort Bragg on a Tuesday morning in a government sedan driven by her aide, Captain Aaron Reeves, who was 27 and very good at his job and had learned in 6 months of working for Frost that she did not like small talk before 9 a.m. and that her silence in a moving vehicle was not an invitation to fill it. She was 54. Compact and precise in the way of someone who had spent 3 decades making herself unignorable in rooms that hadn't wanted her in them. Her uniform was impeccable in the way that communicated not vanity, but seriousness. "This is the standard I hold," the posture said, "and I expect the same from everyone in this building." She had the Fort Bragg Memorial Hospital's last 3 years of records in a binder on her lap. She was reading with her full attention, which was the only way she read anything. "The mortality clustering is in a very specific post-op window," she said, not looking up. "Yes, ma'am. He's 6 to 14 hours post-surgery, 3 times the expected rate." "And the families?" "Settled, quickly. 7 out of 11 reached confidential agreements within 30 days of the deaths." Frost turned a page. That's not grief management. That's damage control. No, ma'am. She closed the binder as the car pulled through the hospital entrance. She looked at the building. 4 stories. Brick. The American flag out front moving in the same wind that had been pressing at Victor Kane's kitchen window all week, though Frost didn't know anything about Victor Kane yet. She would. 3 days had passed since Diana Frost arrived at Fort Bragg Memorial, and in that time she had spoken to 41 hospital employees, reviewed 612 patient records, and drunk approximately 14 cups of coffee that she hadn't finished. She had also, in a meeting that lasted exactly 22 minutes, sized up Dr. Nathaniel Holt with the precision of someone whose job for 30 years had been assessing people who were trying to manage her. Holt was lying. She'd known it within 4 minutes. The question was what exactly he was lying about and how far up the chain it went. Simone Archer, meanwhile, was doing her own investigation with none of Frost's institutional authority and all of her own stubbornness, which was considerable. The mortality anomaly she'd flagged to Holt 3 weeks ago and been told she was misreading. She wasn't misreading it. She had run the numbers 4 times. She had pulled comparison data from 2 other military hospitals. The clustering in that specific post-op window was not random variation. Something was happening to specific patients in those hours, and it was happening with enough consistency to be a pattern, and patterns were not accidents. She couldn't go to Holt. She already knew what he'd say. She couldn't go to the hospital board. Holt controlled it. She couldn't go to Frost's inquiry without something more solid than statistics, because statistics could be argued, and she needed someone on her side who understood exactly what she was looking at. So she started talking to the people who were never asked anything. The nurses, the orderlies, the overnight staff, the people who watched the hospital breathe for 12 hours at a stretch and noticed everything and were asked to report only the things that fit on a form. And she started paying attention to the janitor who knew about potassium protocols. She found him again on a Thursday night. She hadn't been looking exactly. She'd been in the break room with her charts spread across the table and a headache building behind her right eye, muttering to herself about the drug administration timing in patient 4412's post-op record. The door was open. She wasn't paying attention to who was in the corridor. Check the potassium administration window. She looked up. He was at the door with his cleaning cart, not quite in the room, not quite out of it. His voice was even and quiet. If the timing's off by 20 minutes in that protocol, it can precipitate cardiac arrest in compromised patients, especially in combination with the sedation dose that's standard post-op here. The room was absolutely still, except for the fluorescent hum overhead. Simone looked at him for a long moment, and at his uniform, at the cart, at his hands on the cart's handle. Large, completely still, the hands of someone who had learned stillness deliberately. Then she looked at his face, and what she saw there was not the blank attentiveness of someone who had accidentally said something smart. It was the focused, measured expression of someone delivering information they had already weighed and decided to share. He picked up the trash bag and walked out. Simone sat without moving for 60 seconds. Then she pulled patient 4412's drug administration record and started looking at the potassium timing. He was right. She asked around the next morning, carefully, casually, the way you ask about things when you don't want to announce that you're asking. The nursing staff knew Victor by name, but not much else. Good worker. Quiet. He'd been here about 4 years. Loretta Banks, the charge nurse who'd been on this floor for 23 years and knew everything worth knowing about the hospital, said, "That man has a mind like nothing I've ever seen. I asked him once about a patient who was declining, and I don't know why I asked a janitor, but he said something about electrolyte management that my attending didn't catch until the next morning." She paused. I always thought there was something about him. Simone went to the records office and asked a clerk named Deborah to pull Victor Kane's employment file. Deborah was helpful and thorough and slightly nosy, and she came back with a thin folder and a curious expression. "His background check has a gap," Deborah said. 7 years, no employment history. Before that, U.S. Army. She opened the folder. Rank and specialty are redacted. Simone took the folder back to her office and stared at the redaction for a while. Redacted military specialty. 7-year gap. Hands that knew about potassium protocols in post-op cardiac patients. She thought about that for a long time. Frost's meeting with Holt was in his office, which was exactly the kind of office a man like Holt would have. Diplomas arranged with precision. Desk clear of everything except what he'd chosen to leave out. The whole room a performance of competence and authority. He offered her coffee. She declined. He sat across from her with the relaxed confidence of a man on his own territory, and they went through the formal pleasantries of a congressional inquiry meeting, and Frost asked her questions, and Holt gave her answers, and every answer was smooth, responsive, and approximately 60% complete. The families were supported through our standard bereavement protocol, Holt said. 11 families settled financial claims within 30 days, Frost said. That's not standard bereavement protocol, that's a legal strategy. Our legal department. I'll need all communications between your legal department and the families, going back 3 years, as well as the original surgical records for each of the 11 cases. A fractional pause. Smooth enough that someone who wasn't looking for it would miss it. Of course, Holt said. We want to support the inquiry fully. After she left, Captain Reeves, waiting in the hall, fell into step beside her. Well? Pull his financial disclosures, Frost said. Personal and professional. Everything. You think he's dirty? I think he's been very comfortable for a very long time, Frost said. And comfortable men get sloppy about covering their tracks because they stop believing anyone's looking. She went back to her temporary office that evening and opened the stack of personnel files her team had been processing. Hospital staff, support services, the full complement of people who worked in this building. She was looking for anyone with a concerning pattern, a complaint history, an anomalous financial situation, a background that didn't add up. She almost passed it. The redacted entry was in the support staff records, 3rd page of the environmental services roster. Standard format, standard information. Except for 2 things. The redaction pattern was one she recognized from a specific type of classified military file, and the date of the redaction, 17 years ago, landed in a year that meant something to her. She pulled the full redacted record, read it 3 times. Her hand on the paper was very still. Then she closed the folder and did not tell Captain Reeves what she had seen. On Friday night, Victor was cleaning the supply room adjacent to the surgical suite when he heard voices. He wasn't eavesdropping. He was doing his job, working the shelves in the back of the room, and the conversation started in the corridor outside and moved into the adjacent space, a small anteroom used for equipment storage that shared a wall with the supply room. The voices were not raised. They were careful. They were the voices of men who thought they were alone. One was Holt's. Victor recognized it from hearing it over 4 years, in corridors, in the nurse's station, in the particular carrying quality it had when Holt was performing authority for an audience. The other he didn't know. Older. Deliberate cadence. A man accustomed to being the calmest person in any room. The Calder account needs to be reconciled by end of month, the second voice said. Holt. Thursday's case is scheduled. It'll move before the inquiry gets into the specifics. Make sure it does. Frost is thorough. I can manage Frost. A pause. Something in the quality of the silence communicated that the second man did not share this confidence. You manage your end, he said. I'll manage mine. Thursday. Footsteps. Gone. Victor stood in the supply room and did not move for 30 seconds. His mind, which had been going quiet at 4 a.m. for 4 years, was now very, very loud. He ran the words back. The Calder account. Thursday's case. It'll move before the inquiry gets into the specifics. He didn't know what it meant yet. but he was trained to memorize things under pressure, and what he'd heard was now locked in with the same precision he'd once used to memorize surgical protocols in field conditions where there was no time to look anything up. He finished cleaning the supply room. He replaced every item exactly as he'd found it. He pushed his cart into the corridor and continued his rounds. His face, if anyone had been watching, showed nothing. Dustin Reeves was getting worse. Victor had been watching it for 2 weeks with the helpless, controlled attention of a man who sees a problem clearly and has no standing to act on it officially. The decline was subtle enough that the overnight staff's charting didn't capture it. Vital signs that were individually within acceptable ranges, but collectively formed a pattern, a drift, a slow movement in a direction that didn't match Dustin's diagnosis or his treatment protocol. Victor changed his cleaning schedule so that he passed room 412 every 40 minutes. He wasn't sure what he was going to do with what he was observing. He knew he couldn't do nothing. On Sunday evening, Dustin was awake when Victor passed the door. The young man was looking at the origami crane on his nightstand with the unfocused attention of someone who'd been lying still for too long. He looked up when the door opened. "Hey," Dustin said, and his voice had the thin quality of someone whose lungs weren't quite right. "Hey." Victor stopped in the doorway. "How are you feeling?" "Like garbage." A pause. "Sorry." "Don't apologize for honesty." Dustin looked at the crane. "Someone keeps leaving these. You know who does that?" Victor looked at the crane. "No idea." Dustin almost smiled. It was a small, tired expression, but it was real. "Well, I appreciate it, whoever it is." He looked at Victor with eyes that were tired but not dull. There was something still sharp in there, still present. "You're the guy who's here every night." "I work the overnight shift." "You slow down when you pass my room." Victor met his eyes. "I do." Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then a nurse came in to check vitals, and Victor moved his cart down the hall. And Dustin Reeves watched him go with the careful attention of a young man who had learned in the Army to notice the things that other people walked past. Simone found Victor on Monday night. She had been building toward it for a week, watching him, thinking about him, going back and forth in her mind about whether this was rational or whether she had spent too many nights alone with her charts and was starting to see things. In the end, what decided her was the potassium protocol. He had been right, and right in a way that required not just knowledge, but clinical reasoning, the ability to see the interaction between two variables in a specific patient population and understand what it meant in real time. That was not something you got from reading. That was something you got from years of practice. She found him in a corridor near the ICU wing, late, maybe 10:30. She waited until the nearest nurse had rounded a corner. Then she stepped in front of his cart and said, "Tell me how you know about potassium administration protocols." Victor looked at her. The look lasted long enough to be deliberate. "You've been looking into me." I asked a few questions. "What did you find?" "A redacted military file and a 7-year employment gap." She kept her voice low and level. "What I didn't find is any explanation for how a janitor in an environmental services uniform knows things that most of my attendings don't know." Victor was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're looking at a drug interaction. But the drug interaction is not the whole picture. The whole picture is surgical decision-making in the OR. Specifically, who is making calls on post-op sedation and whether those calls are medical decisions or something else." Simone stared at him. Her heart was doing something complicated. "Who are you?" Victor picked up the trash bag from the can beside the wall. "I'm the man who cleaned your break room," he said, and walked away. She stood in the corridor watching him go. Her chart was in her hands. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. She stood there for a long time. "Someone's been asking questions about the court-martial," Marcus said. It was Wednesday chess. The board was set up. The coffee was made. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the oaks were losing their leaves in slow orange spirals. Victor looked up from his pieces. What questions? Who filed the original complaint? Whether the surgical log was ever independently verified? Or whether you were the only surgeon on the case? Marcus moved his opening pawn. Recent questions. Someone with access to the JAG records database. That's not a civilian inquiry. That's someone inside the system. Victor was still. How recent, he said. 2 weeks. The same 2 weeks since Frost arrived at Fort Bragg Memorial. Victor looked at the chessboard, the same board they'd been playing on for 4 years. He was playing black. He could see 4 moves ahead to checkmate, the same as always. He hadn't decided yet whether to take it. She came here for the mortality inquiry, Victor said. Not for me. Maybe she found something while she was looking for something else. Or maybe she's trying to build a case before moving on the inquiry. Clean up everything connected to the hospital, including me. Marcus studied him. Or maybe, he said quietly, she's a person who looked at something that happened 17 years ago and decided it wasn't right. Victor moved his knight. It was not toward checkmate. It was a patient move, a developing move, a move that kept options open. Your bishop's still exposed, he said. Marcus looked at the board. I know, he said. I'm deciding whether to protect it. They played until midnight. Neither of them said anything else about the court-martial or Frost or the questions being asked inside the JAG system. But when Marcus left and Victor was washing the coffee cups in the small kitchen sink, he stopped with his hands in the water and stood very still for a moment. Then he dried his hands, walked to the bedroom, and crouched down beside the bed. He pulled out the metal box. He didn't open it. He carried it to the kitchen table and set it down in the light. Sat in front of it. The combination lock faced him. He had not dialed it in 11 years. He knew the combination the way he knew his own blood type, the way he knew the steps of every procedure he'd ever performed. Not by effort, but by permanence, the way some things settle into a person and stay. He sat with the box on the table for a long time. He didn't open it, but he didn't put it back under the bed. He left it there, on the kitchen table, in the light, and went to bed, and lay in the dark, listening to the wind move the last of the oak leaves from the branches outside his window. The days leading up to Thursday moved the way days do when something is coming, not faster, not slower, but with a particular quality of weight, as if the air itself had thickened slightly. Victor felt it. He didn't have a name for what he was feeling exactly. He'd spent 4 years training himself out of anticipation, out of the forward-leaning alertness that had once been his natural state in a surgical theater. But the supply room conversation had planted something in him that he couldn't quite quiet, and every time he passed room 412 and heard Dustin Reeves breathing doing that wrong thing, the thing he couldn't officially respond to, the feeling got heavier. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear. Victor was on shift by 6. He changed his route twice in the first 2 hours, working reasons into it that would look natural on paper. The east corridor needed a second pass. The elevator bay by the surgical suite had tracked mud from the overnight intake. He wasn't sure what he was watching for. And he knew only that someone had said Thursday, and that the someone who said it had been standing in the dark, talking to Holt in a voice that was calm, the way a flat sea is calm before weather. At 11:47, the ambulance bay doors opened. The ER received Sergeant First Class Raymond Cole at 11:49 a.m. He came in on a gurney, conscious but barely, his face the color of old concrete. Training accident, a compression injury to the chest during a live equipment exercise, the kind of thing that happened rarely and catastrophically. The EMTs were talking fast. Breath sounds diminished on the left, blood pressure dropping. The attending physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, not the chess-playing Marcus, a different man entirely, younger, capable, got to work immediately. He was good under pressure. He moved through his assessment with clean efficiency and arrived at the same conclusion within 4 minutes that Victor, hearing it all from the corridor outside, arrived at in 90 seconds. Cardiac tamponade, blood collecting in the pericardial sac, squeezing the heart from the outside, stopping it from filling properly. Every beat weaker than the last. Raymond needed a surgeon. He needed one now. The ER attending called for the surgical team. Dr. Holt was in a meeting with Frost's inquiry team and his phone was going to voicemail. His second, Dr. Gareth Price, was paged and arrived in 4 minutes, which felt like 40. Victor was at the corridor entrance with his cart, not inside the bay, technically not in the way of anything. He could see through the window in the bay door. He watched Price do his assessment. He watched Price's face, and he watched Price order a medication sequence that was, in the specific context of Raymond Cole's presentation, wrong in a way that was going to cost Raymond Cole his life. Victor stood very still. He had been standing still for 17 years. He had learned to do it so well that stillness had become his default, his armor, the condition under which he functioned. He was the man who mopped the floor. He had no license, no standing, no legal right to walk through that door and say a word about anything. Raymond's monitor spiked, stuttered, and flatlined. Victor pushed through the door. The bay went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens. Not silence. The monitors were still alarming. People were still moving. But a quality of collective attention that swung toward the door and the man walking through it. Victor moved to the table. His hands found gloves from the crash cart supply. With the automatic reach of someone who had done it so many times, the motion was below conscious thought. He snapped them on. He looked at Raymond Cole's face, 31 years old, jaw slack, the 82nd airborne tattoo on his wrist. And then he looked at the monitor. And then he looked at Price. "He needs a needle decompression," Victor said. "Left side, 4th intercostal space. Right now. Someone hand me a 14 gauge. Price turned on him. "Who the hell are you? Get out of this. There is blood in the pericardial space compressing the heart." Victor's voice did not change. It was even, precise, and carried across the room without being raised. "Your defibrillation will not work until that pressure is relieved. You have approximately 90 seconds before the damage is irreversible. Hand me the needle or pick it up yourself." The room held its breath. Price was a surgeon. He knew cardiac tamponade. He knew, in the part of his mind that was still purely medical and hadn't been touched by whatever else he'd become involved in, that what this man in a janitor's uniform had just said was correct. The problem was every other part of him, the part that answered to Holt, the part that had been in that supply room corridor, the part that knew this patient's name was on a list. Loretta Banks was the charge nurse on duty. She had worked this floor for 23 years. She had seen bad decisions made by men with credentials and good decisions made by people nobody gave credit to. And she had a 30-year education in the difference between authority and competence. She looked at Price. She looked at Victor. She picked up the 14-gauge needle and held it out. Victor took it. The room went still in a different way after that. The stillness of people watching something they will remember. Victor worked with the quiet focus of a man who has performed this procedure so many times that fear has been replaced entirely by knowledge. He talked as he worked, not loudly, not performing, just narrating the way he always had in the OR, because a good surgeon keeps the room informed, because everyone around the table should understand what's happening, because medicine is not a solo act. Angle of entry, 45 degrees toward the left shoulder. You're aiming for the pericardial space, not the myocardium. If you hit myocardium, the patient will tell you you'll feel the ventricle. Back off 2 millimeters and redirect. The needle moved. His hands were perfectly steady. The resistance changes when you enter the sac. Don't advance past that point. Dark blood filled the syringe. On the monitor, a blip. A pause that lasted long enough for two people in the room to stop breathing. Then a rhythm. Irregular at first, then steadying, then settling into the unmistakable pattern of a heart that had been given back its room to beat. Raymond Cole's chest rose. The room was absolutely silent except for the monitor. Then Loretta Banks said, very quietly, "Sweet Jesus." One of the younger nurses had her hand over her mouth. Dr. Price stood 3 feet away, motionless, his face doing something complicated in private that he would have to deal with later, somewhere else. Victor stripped his gloves and dropped them in the waste bin. "He'll need a cardiothoracic consult and imaging within the hour," he said. "The tamponade may reaccumulate. Watch the neck veins and the pressure trend." He picked up his mop from where he'd left it outside the bay door. He began to walk out. Diana Frost was in the hallway. She had been walking toward the ER to follow up on something from that morning's inquiry documents when the code was called, and she'd stopped. The trained observer's instinct, the reflexive attention of someone who had spent a career noticing things. She'd watched through the window in the bay door. She'd seen everything. When Victor walked out and nearly collided with her, they were 3 feet apart, and there was nowhere to go. Victor went still. Frost went still. 17 years collapsed into the 3 feet between them. Victor's face moved through something, not fear, not rage, but something older than either, something carefully managed over a very long time, and then settled back into the stillness he'd built for himself. Frost's face was unreadable, in the way that faces are unreadable when their owner is working very hard. She said, "I need you in my office, now." Victor looked at her for one more moment. Then he set his mop against the wall. "All right," he said. Behind them, in the bay, Raymond Cole's monitor kept its steady green rhythm. His hand lay still on the hospital bed, palm up. The 82nd Airborne tattoo catching the fluorescent light, the same insignia Victor had worn on his own uniform in a photograph that currently faced the wall of an apartment 12 minutes away. Frost's temporary office was a converted consultation room on the 2nd floor, a table, 4 chairs, a window that looked out over the parking lot. She had made it functional the way she made everything functional, cleared of unnecessary items, organized in a way that reflected how her mind worked, the inquiry documents in ordered stacks that only looked random. She told Captain Reeves to wait outside. He didn't ask why. He closed the door. Victor sat across from her without being asked. He folded his hands on the table. His uniform was clean, his face was composed. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this conversation for a long time and had decided somewhere along the way that when it came, he would meet it sitting down. Frost sat across from him and for a moment said nothing. She was doing what she always did in the first moments of a difficult conversation, taking inventory, not of the room, of herself. Checking whether she was clear, whether she was objective, whether she had let anything cloud the precision she needed. "Your name is Victor Kane," she said. "You've been employed by this hospital's Environmental Services Department for 4 years. Before that, 7 years with no employment record. Before that, United States Army, Lieutenant Colonel, combat surgeon." She paused. "You just performed a successful pericardiocentesis on a critically ill patient without a license, without authorization, and in front of approximately 9 witnesses. 10, Victor said. "You were in the hallway." 10, Frost agreed. Silence. Outside, a cart rolled past in the corridor. Someone laughed at the nurse's station, a quick, ordinary sound from a world that was continuing normally 6 feet away. "Why are you here?" Frost said. "In this hospital, doing this job." Victor looked at her steadily. "I needed somewhere to be." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have that's honest." Frost held his gaze. In 17 years, she had not allowed herself to think about Victor Kane very often. When she had, late usually in the particular honesty of late nights, she had framed it cleanly. She had prosecuted the evidence presented to her. The evidence had been compelling. The finding had been the finding of the board, and not solely hers. She had believed in the system. She had done her job. Sitting across from him now, in a room that smelled of institutional coffee and old documents, she was aware that believing in the system and doing her job were things that could be true and still not be enough. She said, "I found your redacted file. I assumed you would. I've been in contact with Eleanor Voss." Something moved through Victor's face. Very small. He controlled it immediately, but she had been watching for it, and she saw it. "Then, you know what she found," he said. "I know what she believes she found. I haven't verified it yet." "The surgical log was altered," Victor said. His voice was level, not angry, not pleading. The voice of a man stating something he had known for 17 years and had made his peace with in a way that looked like peace, but was actually just endurance. The patient had a pre-existing coronary abnormality that was removed from his medical record by his father. I operated without that information. No surgeon in the world saves that patient with that information. The log was changed afterward to make it look like a procedural error because someone needed a reason, and I was the most convenient person available. Frost was quiet. "I know," she said. Victor looked at her. "Not when it mattered," she said, "but I know now." She held his gaze and didn't look away from it, which cost her something. "I should have looked harder at the time. You prosecuted the evidence you were given. I should have questioned who gave it to me and why." Victor said nothing. Outside the window, a car pulled into the parking lot, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. The silence between them was not comfortable, but it was honest, and honest silence was something they could both work with. Then Victor said, "I'm not here about me. I came to tell you something about this hospital." Frost pulled a legal pad toward her. "Tell me." He told her about the supply room conversation, the Calder account, Thursday. The civilian voice he hadn't recognized. He laid it out with the precision of a man trained to relay critical information accurately and quickly, dates, exact words where he had them, the sequence of what he'd heard. Frost wrote without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at her notes. "Calder," she said. "I don't have more than the name." "I might." She turned to a stack of documents on her right. "Boyd Calder. He came up in the Financial Disclosure Review 2 days ago. A tangential connection. Corporate entity 3 layers removed from Holt's personal investment portfolio. I flagged it and moved on." She looked at Victor. "I should have stayed with it." "Now you know to stay with it." "Dr. Archer has been running a parallel investigation into the mortality data," Frost said. "She came to me yesterday with a statistical analysis. I told her I needed more documentation before I could act on it." She paused. "I was being careful, maybe too careful." "There's a patient on the 4th floor," Victor said. "Corporal Dustin Reeves. His decline doesn't match his diagnosis or his treatment protocol. Someone has been adjusting his medications in a way that doesn't show up in the electronic record. Paper addendum on the physical chart." He watched her face. "I've been watching him for 2 weeks." Frost looked at him for a moment. Not the assessment look, something quieter. "You've been watching him." "I pass his room every 40 minutes. She held his gaze. Then she picked up her phone and called Captain Reeves. Simone was in her office when Victor knocked. She looked up, and something in his face made her put down her pen immediately. He closed the door. He sat across from her desk, and he told her about Calder, the supply room conversation, what he'd told Frost, the 3-layer corporate structure in Holt's financials. Simone listened without moving. She had a stillness of her own when she was processing, hands flat on the desk, eyes direct, the same quality of concentrated attention she brought to a difficult surgical problem. When he finished, she said, "I found something else." She opened her desk drawer and laid out 4 printed pages, photographs of chart entries, the paper addenda that didn't exist in the electronic system. 4 patients over 8 months, specific post-op windows, specific medication adjustments. "They're not all dead," she said. 2 of them are still here, declining in ways that look like natural disease progression unless you know what you're looking for. She looked at Victor. "I know what I'm looking for because you told me what to look for." Victor studied the pages. His face did the thing it sometimes did when he was working, went very quiet. Very focused, the external stillness that meant the internal machinery was moving fast. "The potassium timing," he said, "in combination with the sedation adjustment. Someone with surgical knowledge is doing this deliberately and carefully. Not Holt personally, he hasn't been directly involved in these patients' care, but someone he has access to." She paused. "Price." Victor looked up. "I've been watching Price for 2 weeks," Simone said. "He's been making unsanctioned visits to specific post-op patients, always when the floor is quiet, always brief." She met Victor's eyes. He's not treating them, he's checking on them, making sure the process is moving. The room was quiet. From somewhere down the hall came the ordinary sounds of a hospital in the early evening, a call bell, a cart, someone's television at low volume. "Does Frost know about Price?" Victor said. "Not yet." "She needs to." "I know." Simone looked at her pages. "I need more time to build the documentation. If I go to her now with what I have, Holt's lawyers will dismantle it in a day." "How much time?" 48 hours? Dustin Reeves may not have 48 hours. Simone held his gaze. "I know that too." Victor went home at 2 in the morning. The kitchen table was where he'd left it, the metal box sitting in the light. He made coffee he didn't drink and sat in front of it for a while. Then he dialed the combination, left, right, left, the numbers as permanent in his memory as his own name, and opened it. Inside, his military ID card, corners worn, his medical license, long expired, the paper soft from years in the box. A notebook. On 43 pages of handwritten account. The surgery, the court-martial, everything he'd remembered and recorded in the year after, because a part of him had known even then that memory was the only protection he had. His medals, loose in the bottom of the box, cool against his fingers. And one more thing. An envelope, sealed, with a return address from the Army JAG Corps and a postmark 8 years old. He'd received it at an address he'd been at for only 3 months. He'd looked at the return address and felt something close down in him, and he'd put it in the box without opening it, because he had spent that particular year trying very hard not to be pulled backward into something that had already taken enough. He opened it now. The letter was from an attorney named Eleanor Voss. The language was careful, precise, the kind of legal writing that was trying to communicate urgency without being able to prove everything it was urgency about. She had found, in the course of reviewing an unrelated case, documentation that suggested the surgical log used in his 2008 court-martial proceeding had been materially altered after the surgery. The alteration had been traced to a records clerk in the office of General Marcus Aldridge. She had not been able to establish the chain of command beyond the clerk. She had tried to reach Victor at 3 addresses. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table beside the box and looked at it. 8 years. The letter had been sitting in this box for 8 years while he mopped floors and folded cranes and told himself that the quiet life was the life he'd chosen, and that choice was not the same as defeat. He picked up the letter again, read Voss's name. Frost had said she'd been in contact with her. He sat there for a long time in the kitchen light, with the letter in his hands and the medals in the open box, and the coffee going cold beside him. The October wind had died down. The oaks outside were almost bare now, just the last few leaves holding on. Then he reached across the table and picked up his pen. The next morning, the nurse on the 4th floor found the paper addendum in Dustin Reeves' physical chart. She almost didn't. She'd been checking the IV line routine and had flipped through the chart looking for a previous lab result, and the addendum was tucked between 2 pages in a way that would have been easy to miss. A medication adjustment, unsigned, in handwriting that wasn't anyone's on the current rotation. A specific drug, a specific dose, in a specific window that corresponded to the hours when Dustin had been declining fastest. She looked at the addendum. She looked at Dustin, awake in the bed, watching her with those tired but sharp eyes. "I didn't ask for a medication change," Dustin said. The nurse closed the chart. She was 26 years old and 3 years out of nursing school, and she had been on this floor long enough to know the difference between a paperwork error and something that required moving fast. "I'll get the attending," she said. She was already moving when she left the room. In the corridor outside, Victor's cleaning cart was parked at its usual spot. Victor was not beside it. He was standing at the window at the end of the hall, looking out at the pale morning, his hands in his pockets. When the nurse came out of room 412 walking fast, he turned and watched her go. His face showed nothing, but his hands in his pockets were very still, the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting and is now watching the thing they were waiting for begin to move. The nurse who found Dustin Reeves's chart was named Carla Simmons, and she did exactly the right thing. She went straight to the ICU attending, Dr. James Okafor, and put the physical chart in his hands and said, "This addendum isn't from anyone on our rotation." Okafor read it twice, looked at Dustin's most recent vitals, and went cold in the quiet way that good doctors go cold when they understand that what they're looking at is not negligence but intention. He ordered the medication stopped. He ordered new labs. He called Simone. Simone was in the stairwell between the 2nd and 3rd floors when her phone rang, because that was where she'd been spending 10 minutes of every hour for the past 2 days, moving between floors, keeping her head down, building her documentation file with the careful, unhurried patience of someone who understood that a case built too fast is a case with cracks in it. She listened to Okafor for 45 seconds, said, "I'm coming," and was already moving. Victor, when she passed him in the 2nd floor corridor, got one look at her face and followed. Dustin Reeves was awake and frightened in the specific way that young soldiers get frightened, not visibly, not loudly, but with a tightness around the eyes and a stillness in the body that spoke of someone running internal calculations about how bad this actually was. Or he looked at the cluster of people who'd come into his room and said, "Tell me straight." Okafor told him straight. Someone had been adjusting his medications in a way that wasn't authorized and wasn't helping him. They were going to fix it. He was going to be all right. Dustin looked past Okafor to Victor, standing near the door in his janitor's uniform. "You knew," Dustin said. Not an accusation, just recognition. "I suspected," Victor said. "I didn't have the standing to act on it officially. You were watching my room. Every 40 minutes. Dustin looked at him for a long moment. Something settled in his face, not relief exactly, but a kind of steadying. "Okay," he said, "fix it." What followed was 6 hours that Victor would remember for a long time, not because they were dramatic, they weren't, not on the surface. Okafor was running the case officially, making the calls, signing the orders. Victor stood back from the bedside and kept his hands in his pockets except when he was talking, and he talked carefully, measuring each piece of information he gave against what Okafor needed and what he could offer without overstepping a boundary that both of them understood without naming it directly. But the treatment protocol Victor was describing, the specific sequencing of interventions for the kind of mitochondrial disruption Dustin's system was showing, was not in any standard textbook. It existed in Victor's memory from a Baghdad field hospital in 2006, a patient with a similar presentation, a night when the generator kept cutting out, and he'd had to work by flashlight and adapt everything he knew on the fly. The patient had lived. Victor had written up his protocol afterward in the field notes that no one ever read because the war moved on. Okafor followed every instruction with the focused precision of a young doctor who was smart enough to know when he was learning something real. He didn't ask where it came from until it was over, until Dustin's numbers had begun their slow turn toward stability, until the immediate danger had passed and the room had gone from tense to merely watchful. Then he turned to Victor and said, "Where did you learn that?" Victor said, "Fallujah." Okafor looked at him, at the uniform, the cart parked outside the door, the man who had just walked him through a treatment protocol that probably needed to be published. "Who are you?" he said. Not the way Simone had asked it, which was the question of someone building toward confrontation. The way Okafor asked it was simpler. It was the question of someone who had just watched something extraordinary and needed to understand it. "Right now," Victor said, "I'm the person who helped you save that kid." Okafor looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded, turned back to Dustin's chart, and let it go. Some things didn't need more explanation than that. Holt moved fast. He had heard about the ER incident within an hour of it happening. His hospital, his surgical suite, 10 witnesses, a man in a janitor's uniform performing a pericardiocentesis on a soldier who then lived. The fact that Raymond Cole had lived was the least important part of this to Holt. The important parts were, an unlicensed individual had performed a medical procedure in his hospital, and that individual was the same man he knew. From a file he'd been shown 3 years ago by Boyd Calder to be a former Army surgeon who had been court-martialed and stripped of his credentials, which meant that Victor Kane's presence in this hospital was either a coincidence or it wasn't. And Holt had not gotten to where he was by believing in coincidences. He called his lawyer before he called the ICU. The complaint he filed was formal and legally precise. Unauthorized practice of medicine, patient safety violations, immediate removal recommended pending investigation. He filed it with the State Medical Board and copied the Department of the Army's Medical Affairs Division, and he added a personal note to his contact at Medical Affairs that read, "In the careful language of men who understood how to communicate between the lines. This individual requires administrative resolution before the current inquiry advances." Then he went to Frost. Her office door was open. He knocked twice and entered with the smooth confidence of a man on his own territory, which was a habit so ingrained in him that he did it even in rooms that weren't his. "I need to discuss a serious patient safety concern," he said. Frost looked up from her documents. "Sit down, Dr. Holt." He sat. He laid out the case against Victor with exactly the right balance of institutional concern and carefully performed alarm. An unlicensed individual, a vulnerable patient, the liability exposure for the hospital. He said nothing about knowing who Victor was. He said nothing about the court-martial. And he let the legal framework do the work. Frost listened with the attentiveness she brought to everything, which was complete and gave nothing away. When Holt finished, she said, "I'll review the situation." After he left, she opened Victor's redacted file again. She read Eleanor Voss's notes, which she had obtained 2 days earlier and had been working through carefully. She read the section about the surgical log. She read the name of the records clerk. Then she picked up her phone and called Voss directly. The conversation lasted 22 minutes. When it ended, Frost sat very still at her desk for a while. Then she called her congressional contact. "I need authorization to expand the inquiry scope," she said. "What started as a mortality review has become a criminal investigation. I need CID, and I need it quietly." Her contact said, "How quickly?" Frost looked at Holt's complaint, sitting on her desk next to Voss's notes. "Yesterday," she said. Victor was in the basement supply closet. His supply closet, the one with the small stool and the single lamp, and the medical textbook he'd been reading for 4 years. When he heard footsteps, he recognized. Simone knocked once and came in without waiting, which told him something about the quality of what she was carrying. She sat on the floor across from him because there was only one stool. She had 3 printed pages in her hand. Price has been making unsanctioned visits to 4 patients over the past 8 months, she said. I have time-stamped footage from the floor cameras. I asked the security office for a routine audit review and pulled it myself. I have the chart addenda photographed and documented. I have the lab work showing the specific drug interactions in 2 patients who survived. She looked at Victor. And I know what the Calder account is. Victor was still. Boyd Calder runs a fund, Simone said. I found him through the corporate structure in Holt's financials. Frost's team had flagged the connection and left it. I followed it the rest of the way. The fund is tied to a specific insurance instrument that pays out on mortality events in military healthcare facilities. The payout structure is indexed to patient age, service record, and benefit value. Younger veterans with longer projected benefit streams generate larger payouts. She stopped. She said it flatly, the way you say something when the only alternative is not saying it at all. They were selecting patients based on what their deaths were worth. The lamp hummed. Somewhere above them, the hospital moved through its evening rhythms. How many? Victor said. 11 confirmed, possibly more going back further than my data covers. She held his gaze. Dustin Reeves would have been 12. Victor looked at his hands, those large, steady hands that had been in his pockets for 4 years. Frost needs everything you have, he said. Tonight. I know, but if I go to her now and Holt finds out before CID is in position. Holt filed a complaint against me this afternoon, Victor said. He's moving, which means Calder is moving. You don't have until tomorrow. Simone looked at him. She made the decision the way she made surgical decisions, quickly, on the best available information, without flinching from the weight of it. I'll go to Frost tonight, she said. Why, but I need you to do something first. What? Buy me 2 hours. Victor went to Holt's office at 7:15 in the evening. He knocked. Holt's assistant had gone for the day. Holt was still at his desk, which didn't surprise Victor. Men like Holt worked late when things were moving, when they needed the illusion of control that came from being the last person in the building. He looked up when Victor appeared in the doorway, and his face did the thing that faces do when they encounter something they weren't prepared for, a fractional recalibration, quick and almost invisible. Mr. Kane, Holt said. He said it the way you say a name when you're deciding what to do with it. I want a formal hearing, Victor said, before the hospital board, on the record, regarding the ER incident. Holt looked at him steadily. You want a hearing? I want my account entered into the official record. Whatever the outcome, I want it documented. Victor stood in the doorway, not entering the office, not retreating from it. I'll waive the standard notice period. I'll appear whenever the board can convene. The thing about this request, Victor understood, was that it was the last thing Holt wanted. Holt wanted quiet. He wanted Victor processed through the complaint he'd filed, administrative, behind closed doors, handled. A formal board hearing meant witnesses, official record, Loretta Banks and James Okafor, and every nurse in that ER bay testifying about what they saw. It meant attention at exactly the moment Holt needed the opposite. Holt's jaw was tight, but his voice stayed smooth. I'll relay your request to the board secretary, he said. I appreciate it. Victor turned to leave, stopped. How's your cardiothoracic consult covering Sergeant Cole? His tamponade had an unusual fluid composition. The imaging should show a secondary collection forming. Holt said nothing. I'd check it tonight, Victor said pleasantly, and walked away. He had bought Simone 2 hours and 20 minutes. Simone uploaded her files to the cloud account at 8:47 p.m. She was standing in the hospital parking lot to do it, away from the building's network, on her personal phone's data connection. The folder contained 411 photographs, 12 pages of statistical analysis, the security footage timestamps, and a summary document she had written in the spare, precise language of someone building an evidence package rather than telling a story. She sent the access link to Frost. Then she walked back to her car and found her driver's side window broken. The car had been locked. Her laptop bag was on the passenger seat, undisturbed. Her personal phone, the one she'd used for the upload, was in her coat pocket. The only thing missing was the portable hard drive she kept in the center console. She stood in the cold parking lot air and understood exactly what this meant. Someone had been watching her. Someone knew she had been building a case, and the fact that they'd taken the hard drive and left the laptop meant they knew the hard drive was the significant item, which meant they knew more about her investigation than she'd realized. She called Victor. He answered on the first ring. "My car was broken into," she said. "They took the hard drive." "The backup?" "Already uploaded. Frost has it." One beat of silence. "Are you safe right now?" "I'm in the parking lot. I'm fine." She looked at the broken window. The cold was coming through fast. "They didn't get anything that matters." "Get inside the building," Victor said. "Stay where people can see you until Frost has CID in position." She went back inside. Frost received Simone's files at 8:52 p.m. and spent 40 minutes going through them with her full attention, which meant the rest of the world ceased to exist. Captain Reeves brought her coffee at 9:15, and she didn't touch it. At 9:30, she called her congressional contact again. "I have the full evidentiary package," she said. 11 deaths, documented mechanism, named individuals, corporate structure with paper trail. I need CID authorization, and I need federal involvement, given the financial instrument's interstate reach." Her contact was quiet for a moment. "Boyd Calder. You know the name?" "He's been on a peripheral watch list for 2 years. Defense contracting irregularities. Nothing that stuck." A pause. "This sticks." "Yes," Frost said, "it does." By 10 p.m. she had authorization. By 10:30, Captain Reeves was coordinating with the Fort Bragg CID office and a federal contact at the U.S. Attorney's Office who had been waiting, in a general sense, for something exactly like this. The machinery, once pointed in the right direction, moved with a speed that came from months of accumulated pressure finally finding its release. Frost called Simone at 11 and told her to go home, lock her door, and not discuss the case with anyone until morning. Simone said she understood. She sat in her office for another hour instead, which Frost probably expected. Price broke on a Friday morning. It happened in the corridor outside the 4th floor nurse's station, which was perhaps not where he'd intended it to happen, but these things rarely happen where you intend them to. He had been in Dustin Reeves' room, not to harm him, the time for that had passed and he knew it, but perhaps out of the thing that had been driving him for months, the compulsive, horrified need to look at what he'd been part of. To stand in the doorway and see the man who had almost died because of choices Price had made and let himself feel the full weight of it. Simone was coming out of the stairwell when she saw him in the corridor. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and something in his face, something raw and exhausted and past the point of performance, made her stop. "I have documentation," he said. His voice was low. The nurse's station was 30 feet away. "Everything. Dates, amounts, names, what I was told to do, and when." He reached into his coat pocket and held out a USB drive. His hand was not entirely steady. "I've been keeping it for 6 months. I didn't know what to do with it." Simone looked at the drive. She looked at his face. He was 41 years old and looked 60 this morning, the particular aging that comes not from years, but from specific choices whose full cost you've been carrying alone. "There's a recording," Price said. "Calder, explaining the structure, how the payouts worked, who authorized each case. I recorded it on my phone during a meeting 8 months ago." He paused. "I didn't tell him." "Why are you giving this to me?" Simone said. "Because you're the one who was right when everyone told you that you were wrong." He held the drive out and didn't drop his arm. "And because I'm a coward who waited too long, and I know that, and I can't undo the 11 people who died, but maybe I can make sure it stops at 11. Simone took the drive. She went directly to Frost's office. Victor was sitting with Raymond Cole when everything outside the room was accelerating. Raymond had been moved from the ICU to a step-down room that morning, stable enough for the transition, his color better, his eyes carrying the alert, the slightly dazed quality of someone who had been very close to dying and was now recalibrating his relationship with ordinary existence. He looked at Victor's uniform when Victor came in to clean and said, "They told me what you did." Victor set his cart by the door. "How are you feeling?" "Like someone punched a needle into my chest." Raymond considered this, which I gather is accurate. It is. Raymond watched him work for a moment, the unhurried movement, the precise small adjustments. "Why are you working as a janitor?" he said, not rudely, with the directness of a soldier who had decided that proximity to death was a reasonable excuse for skipping polite indirection. Victor was quiet for a moment. "I needed somewhere to be." "You said that already. What does it mean?" Victor looked at him. Raymond was 31, big, direct, the kind of man who took up space in a room not through aggression, but through simple, settled presence. The tattoo on his wrist moved when his hand did, the 82nd Airborne insignia, the same one in the photograph on Victor's wall, the one facing the right way now. 17 years ago, Victor said, I was a surgeon, a good one. I had a patient die on the table during a surgery that should have succeeded, and I was court-martialed for a procedural error that the evidence says I didn't make. I lost my license. I lost my career. I spent some years being lost in other ways. And then I ended up here. He said it without drama, without self-pity, in the same even voice he used for everything. Doing the only thing I could do that kept me close to the work without me having the right to do the work. Raymond was quiet for a while. Outside the window, the morning was moving. Cars in the lot, a bird somewhere, the ordinary sounds of a world that had kept going while Raymond Cole's heart had stopped and been restarted by a man who wasn't supposed to be there. You need to be a surgeon again, Raymond said. It's not that simple. I know it's not simple. Raymond held his gaze. I'm saying you need to do it anyway. A pause. You saved my life, not as a janitor, as a surgeon. You can put on whatever uniform you want, but what you are doesn't change because of what you're wearing. Victor looked at him. This young man who had no idea of the architecture of what he'd just said, who had arrived at it simply and directly, and without the 17 years of weight that Victor brought to it. Sometimes the simplest version of a true thing is the one that lands deepest. To get some rest, Victor said. Raymond almost smiled. You're changing the subject. I am, Victor agreed, and pushed his cart into the corridor. Boyd Calder was not at any address associated with his name. His phone went dark at 11 p.m. Thursday, either powered off or destroyed. His registered business address, a suite in a corporate park 40 miles from Fort Bragg, was empty when CID agents arrived Friday morning. The office cleared of personal items, but not of furniture, the kind of absence that speaks of rapid departure rather than normal closure. His vehicle was at his home address. He was not. Frost received these reports in sequence and processed them without visible alarm, because alarm was a resource she spent carefully. He was warned, she said to Captain Reeves. Holt? Or someone in Holt's network. Someone with enough access to know the authorization had been given. She looked at the map on her tablet. Calder's known addresses, his known vehicles, the 3 corporate entities through which the fund operated. He won't go far. He doesn't have time to restructure the financial instruments before the federal freeze hits. He has to stay close enough to manage the assets. She was right. 12 hours later, a federal agent at a private airfield 30 miles out made a routine credentials check on a man attempting to charter a small plane. The man was calm, cooperative. He smiled during the arrest in the way of someone who was already thinking about what came next. Calder was in federal custody by Friday evening. Holt's turn came Saturday morning. CID arrived at 8 a.m. His lawyer was already there, which meant he'd been waiting, which meant some part of him had understood that waiting was all that was left. The meeting was formal and brief. Holt said nothing. His lawyer said everything. 2 agents stood by the door and said nothing at all. Simone was in the corridor outside the surgical suite when she heard. Loretta Banks came and stood beside her without being asked, just appeared the way Loretta appeared when things mattered, shoulder to shoulder, not saying anything. After a while, Simone said, 11 people. Loretta said, I know. We didn't catch it in time. You caught it? Loretta said. You caught it, and you didn't stop until it was done. She paused. Some battles, you don't get to choose when you find them. Simone looked at the door to the surgical suite. Her surgical suite now, though she hadn't fully understood that yet. She thought about the 11 names in her documentation file. She thought about what it meant to be right about a thing and still not be in time. I need to tell Victor, she said. Loretta gave her a look. Baby, Victor already knows. That man always knows before anyone tells him. He was in the supply closet. His closet, with the stool and the lamp, the medical textbook open on his knee to a chapter on cardiac surgery techniques that had evolved in the years he'd been away. He'd been reading it the way he'd been reading everything for 4 years, to maintain, to update, to keep the knowledge current against the day when knowing it might matter to someone. Simone knocked once and came in. She sat on the floor. Calder's in custody, she said. Holt's being processed. Price's evidence and recording are with the federal investigators. She looked at him. It's done. This part of it. Victor closed the textbook. Dustin? Stable. Okafor thinks he'll be discharged in 2 weeks. She watched his face. You saved his life. Twice. Once by watching his room and once by walking Okafor through that protocol. Victor said nothing. I want you on my surgical team, Simone said. He looked at her. I'm going to be appointed acting chief, she said. Probably permanent eventually. I'm going to rebuild this department correctly, and I need people around me who will tell me when I'm wrong and who understand what it costs when medicine goes wrong and what it means when it goes right. She met his eyes. That's you. But that has always been you. I'm 17 years behind on technique. You invented a treatment protocol in a field hospital that we're going to publish. You're not behind. You're differently current. She held his gaze. Also, I need someone who will tell me when I'm wrong. I can do that. I know you can. A pause. Will you? Victor looked at the textbook in his hands, the stool in the closet, the single lamp. 4 years of this, of being close enough to smell the work, far enough away that he couldn't touch it. He thought about Raymond Cole saying you need to be a surgeon again with the matter-of-fact certainty of a man who'd just had his chest drained by someone in a janitor's uniform. I'll need to apply for license reinstatement, he said. There's a review process. It could take... I know what it takes, Simone said. I'll wait. He looked at her. She looked back steadily, with the patience of someone who had been right about things before, while the world told her she was wrong and had learned to hold her ground in the silence. All right, Victor said. Outside the closet, the hospital moved through its evening hours. A monitor beeped somewhere above them. An elevator arrived on the floor above with a soft mechanical sigh. The ordinary sounds of a place where people came to be put back together, doing what it always did, breathing, moving, continuing. Victor picked up the textbook again. He had 40 pages left in the chapter. He turned to where he'd left off and kept reading. The federal case moved the way large, serious things move, with a momentum that looked slow from the outside and felt relentless from the inside. Boyd Calder was processed, charged and remanded without bail on a Friday evening. By the following Wednesday, the U.S. Attorney's Office had filed 11 counts of conspiracy to commit murder, health care fraud, and corruption of military personnel. Holt's lawyer called the prosecutor on Thursday morning and began the conversation that would end with a guilty plea, a cooperation agreement, and the permanent revocation of a medical license that Holt had spent 25 years building. Price's situation was more complicated. His cooperation had been early, complete, and critical. Without the voice recording and his personal documentation, building the case to the standard required for federal murder charges would have taken months longer and cost considerably more in resources. The U.S. Attorney acknowledged this. The cooperation agreement acknowledged this. What it could not acknowledge, and what Price understood with the clarity of a man who had stopped lying to himself, was that 11 people were dead. His hands hadn't administered the drugs directly, but his decisions had shaped the conditions under which someone else's hands did. That accounting didn't disappear because he'd eventually chosen to be useful. He would not practice medicine again. On the afternoon his agreement was finalized, he sat in a conference room with his lawyer and signed the documents with a steadiness that might have looked like composure to someone who didn't look closely. His lawyer drove him home. Price sat in his apartment that evening with the lights off for a long time, not because he was dramatic about it, but because the dark felt like the honest place to be. Simone heard about the agreement from Captain Reeves. She was in the surgical suite, reviewing the staffing structure she was inheriting, reviewing it methodically, the way she did everything, identifying the gaps and the good people who'd been underutilized and the protocols that needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. She put the phone down after Reeves told her and sat for a moment. Then she opened her desk drawer and took out the USB drive Price had handed her in the corridor. She turned it over in her hand once. Then she put it in her evidence file, sealed it, and went back to her staffing review. She had work to do. The JAG Review Board convened on a Tuesday morning in November. I'm in a room that smelled of old carpet and institutional heating and the particular staleness of a building that processed serious things every day and had stopped noticing the weight of them. Victor arrived in civilian clothes, a dark jacket, pressed shirt, no tie. He had considered the tie and decided against it. He was not performing anything today. He had not been in a formal military proceeding since the court-martial. Walking into the room was its own particular experience. Not terrifying, not nostalgic, but weighty in the way that returning to a place where something significant happened is always weighty. The chairs, the table, the overhead lighting, the officer at the head of the board. All of it familiar, and all of it changed by the 17 years between then and now. Eleanor Voss was there. She was 71. He's smaller than he'd imagined from the letter, with sharp eyes behind wire-framed glasses, and the particular posture of someone who had spent decades in rooms like this one and had long since stopped being intimidated by them. She looked at Victor when he came in and gave him a single nod. Not warm exactly, but direct, and directness from this woman, Victor understood, was its own form of warmth. Diana Frost was there too. She sat to the side, not at the board table. She was a witness, not a voting member, but her presence had been requested by Voss as part of the evidentiary presentation. She looked at Victor when he sat down. He looked at her. Neither of them needed to say anything. The board reviewed the record for 40 minutes, the falsified surgical log, the records clerk's full statement. He had given from a retirement community in Florida 3 weeks earlier, complete and remorseful, and 17 years late. The original patient file, the actual one, reconstructed from parallel records, showing the coronary abnormality that General Aldridge had removed to protect his son's career. The testimony of 2 Army physicians who reviewed the reconstructed record and stated, in the careful language of expert witnesses, that no surgeon operating with the available information could have anticipated or prevented the outcome. Then they asked Victor to speak. He described the surgery. He did it the way he documented everything, precisely, chronologically, without editorializing. The patient's presentation, the information he had, the decisions he made and why, what happened and when. He did not describe what it had cost him. He did not describe the 17 years. He was asked about his actions, and he described his actions, and the board listened with the attentiveness of people who understood that they were hearing something that should have been heard a long time ago. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. One of the board members, a colonel named Patricia Webb, who had been taking careful notes throughout, looked at him over her reading glasses and said, "Lieutenant Colonel Kane, is there anything else you want this board to know?" Victor thought about it honestly, about the apartment with the turned photo, about the supply closet and the single lamp and the textbook, about Dustin Reeves breathing, doing that wrong thing at 4 a.m. What about Raymond Cole's heart coming back on a monitor in a room full of people who had gone completely silent? "No," he said, "I think the record is complete." The board deliberated for 1 hour and 17 minutes. Victor sat in a hallway outside on a wooden chair and watched people walk past. A young JAG officer, a clerk with a stack of files, a private who glanced at him curiously and then looked away. Frost came and sat beside him. They sat without speaking for a while. The heating unit at the end of the hall ticked irregularly. Outside a window at the far end, November was gray and still. "I should have questioned the source," Frost said. She said it quietly, not as a speech, just as the thing she needed to say. "The log. The testimony. I should have asked who stood to gain from the evidence looking the way it looked." Victor looked at the floor. "You were a colonel doing what colonels do. That's not sufficient?" "No," he agreed. "It isn't, but it's true." He paused. "I'm not going to tell you it's all right. It wasn't all right. 17 years wasn't all right." He looked at her directly. "But I'm also not going to spend whatever time I have left carrying it like a stone. I've been doing that, and it doesn't help anyone, including me." Frost was quiet for a moment. "What will you do now?" "Simone Archer has offered me a position on her surgical team. I'm applying for reinstatement." He almost smiled. "Very small, but real. Going to be a lot of paperwork." Frost said, "I'll write whatever letters need to be written." "I know you will." They sat in the hallway for another few minutes. Neither of them said anything else. It was, in its way, the most honest conversation they had ever managed. The door at the end of the hall opened. The officer who had been chairing the board stood in the frame and looked at Victor. "Lieutenant Colonel Kane, we're ready for you." The finding was read in full. The court-martial verdict was overturned. His military record was restored. His medical credentials were eligible for reinstatement upon application to the relevant licensing board. And the board's written recommendation, which Victor had not expected, and which landed somewhere in him like something long held finally released, stated that his reinstatement should be treated as a priority matter given the circumstances of the original proceeding. The officer reading the finding paused near the end. Just a fraction of a second, long enough to be deliberate, not long enough to be unprofessional. He looked up from the document. "Lieutenant Colonel Kane," he said. Victor had not been called that in 17 years. He sat very still. The room was quiet. Voss, to his left, was looking at her hands. Frost, by the wall, was looking at him. Victor looked at the middle distance for a moment, not at anything specific, just at the air in front of him, and let the name settle into him, into the place where it had lived for 17 years underneath everything else, underneath the uniform he'd exchanged for another one, underneath the silence and the mopping and the cranes and the supply closet and all of it. Then he said, "Thank you." It was 2 words. They were enough. Dustin Reeves was discharged on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks later, which was 2 weeks later than they'd hoped, and entirely on time given how close it had been. He walked out of room 412 under his own power, which was a thing that had not seemed guaranteed for a while. His color was good. His eyes were clear. He had, in the weeks of his recovery, become acquainted with most of the nursing staff and had developed a particular friendship with Loretta Banks, who had brought him soup twice and told him without ceremony that the man who had been watching his room every night was named Victor Kane, and he was going to be a surgeon again. He asked to see Victor before he left. Victor came to the room. Dustin was sitting on the edge of the bed in street clothes, his discharge paperwork in his hand, the room behind him stripped back to its institutional neutrality, the nightstand clear, the get-well cards in a bag. But on the nightstand, carefully gathered, were 17 origami cranes. One for each month Victor had worked the 4th floor. Dustin looked at them. Then he looked at Victor. "Loretta told me," he said. Victor said nothing. "Every month," Dustin said, "for a year and a half." He picked up one of the cranes carefully, the way you handle something small that represents something large. "I used to look at these at 2 in the morning when I couldn't sleep and think whoever left them had no idea who I was." He looked at Victor. "But you knew exactly who I was." 24 years old, Victor said. "No family visitors. Tattooed name on your wrist said your mother called you Danny." He paused. "I didn't want you to be alone." Dustin looked at the crane in his hand for a long moment. He had not cried in front of anyone since he enlisted, which was a fact he was generally proud of. He did not try very hard to maintain it now. Victor stood in the room and let the moment be what it was. He didn't offer a hand or a speech. He just stayed, which was what the moment needed. When Dustin had steadied himself, he said, "I'm going to tell people about this." "Tell it right," Victor said. Dustin almost laughed. "A real one." He surprised out of him. "How do you tell a story about someone you can't quite believe is real?" Victor picked up his cart from the doorway. He looked at Dustin one more time. "Start with what you saw," he said. "Everything else follows from that." Raymond Cole was already gone. Discharged 2 weeks earlier, walking out under his own power, with his hand in his wife's, and a look on his face that his wife later described as the look of a man who had been handed something back that he hadn't expected to get. He had shaken Victor's hand in the corridor on his way out. Firm, long, the handshake of someone who understood what they were shaking hands about. "I'm going to tell this story," Raymond had said. "Tell it right," Victor had said. Raymond had smiled at that. "You already said that to someone else today, didn't you?" "It bears repeating." Raymond had looked at him one last time. "Get back in the OR," he said. Not a suggestion. The flat, certain tone of a man whose orders tended to get followed. "The world needs what you know how to do." Victor had watched him walk to the elevator. The doors had closed. He'd stood there in the corridor for a moment, his hand still carrying the warmth of the handshake, and then he'd gone back to work. 6 months passed. They passed the way time passes when it is full of work, quickly in aggregate, slowly in the individual hours, each day distinct and then indistinguishable from the others in memory. The federal trial of Boyd Calder ran for 4 months, involved 47 witnesses, and produced 11 conviction counts. Calder maintained his composure throughout with the consistency of a man who had confused control with invulnerability for so long that losing the first had not yet cost him the second. The judge, during sentencing, made a brief statement about the specific nature of the crime, that it had converted the machinery of healing into an instrument of harm, and that this was among the gravest categories of betrayal the court had encountered. Calder received the rest of his life in federal prison. He was still calm when they let him out. But the calm, this time, had nothing behind it. Holt's guilty plea produced a quieter ending. No dramatic sentencing, no statement from the judge. Just a courtroom, a signed document, and a man walking out into a November afternoon without the title he had spent a career acquiring. His medical license was revoked permanently. He did not contest it. Whatever he had been before he became what he became, the record of what he had done was now the permanent and final version of his story. Simone was formally appointed Chief of Surgery at Fort Bragg Memorial Hospital on a Monday morning in March. The letter arrived in her office, and she read it twice, and then set it down and looked out her window at the parking lot for a while. She had been doing the job for 4 months already, filling the gap left by Holt's removal with the focused competence of someone who had been capable of the role the whole time and had simply been kept from it. The appointment made official what was already true. She reformed the post-op protocols first. Mandatory peer review on all mortality cases, no exceptions. A new documentation system that made paper addenda effectively impossible to use undetected. 3 new surgeons hired in the first month, each of them chosen with an explicit criterion she stated plainly in every interview. Tell me about a time you told a senior colleague they were wrong and why. She got a card in her office mailbox on the day of her appointment. No name on the envelope. Inside, in handwriting, she recognized by now, careful even, the handwriting of someone who had spent years writing things that only they would read. It said, "The data was always right. You were always right to trust it." She put it in her desk drawer. She kept it there. Victor's license reinstatement took 3 months, which was fast by any standard, and which reflected 3 things: the JAG Board's priority recommendation, Frost's letters, plural, a detailed, unambiguous, and the skills assessment that 3 different evaluators discussed afterward in terms they didn't typically use for licensing reviews. The assessment had been thorough. 4 hours of written examination, 2 hours of simulation review, a structured interview with a panel of senior surgeons who had been briefed on the circumstances and had agreed to approach the evaluation without prejudice, which most of them managed. Victor had answered every question the way he answered everything, directly, precisely, without performance. When one panel member asked how he had maintained surgical knowledge over 17 years without practice, Victor described the supply closet, the textbooks, the journals he had read cover to cover, annotating in margins that no one would ever see. The protocols he had developed and revised in his head on overnight shifts when the hospital was quiet and his mind had nowhere else to go. The panel member had been quiet for a moment. Then he'd written something in his notes and moved to the next question. Victor's reinstatement was granted on a Tuesday in April. He received the document in the mail in an envelope with the State Medical Board's return address, and he opened it at the kitchen table where the metal box still sat. Open now, its contents arranged rather than hidden, the medals out, the photograph on the wall facing the right way. He read the document once, then he folded it and put it in the box, with the letter from Eleanor Voss and the notebook and all the rest of it. He sat at the table for a while, not long. There was work to do. His first case back was a cardiac procedure, routine by the standards of cardiac surgery, which meant it was not routine at all, but had a known pathway and a high success rate in experienced hands. Simone had selected it deliberately. Not too simple, not too complex. The right degree of challenge for a return. She didn't tell him she'd selected it deliberately. He knew anyway. He asked for music in the OR gospel, low and steady, the kind of music that doesn't demand your attention, but fills the room with a particular quality of calm. Nobody objected. Loretta Banks, who had arranged her schedule to be the charge nurse on duty that morning, for no reason she stated officially, caught Victor's eye across the surgical suite as he scrubbed in and gave him a single nod. He nodded back. When he stood at the table and looked at the patient, a staff sergeant named Thomas Webb, 44 years old, father of 3, who had no idea that the man about to operate on him had spent 4 years mopping the floors of this same building. Victor looked at the monitoring readings, confirmed the team's positions, checked the instrument layout with one unhurried pass of his eyes. Then he said, "Let's begin." His hands did not shake. They had never shaken, not in Baghdad, not in Fallujah, not in an ER bay with a flatlined monitor and a room full of people watching. They moved with the same steady precision they had always moved with, the precision that came not from absence of feeling, but from feeling that had been fully processed and set aside, leaving only the work. The procedure took 2 hours and 11 minutes. It went without complication. When it was done and the patient was being moved to recovery, Okafor, who had found a reason to be in the OR that morning, standing back and watching with the focused attention of a student in the presence of something worth studying, said quietly, "That was something." Victor stripped his gloves. "It was surgery," he said. "Yes," Okafor said. "It was." Marcus Webb came for chess on the Wednesday after the procedure. He brought the board. Victor made the coffee. Outside, the April evening was soft and warm, the oak trees fully green again, the year having turned back around to where it started. Marcus set up the pieces without speaking for a while. When he finished, he looked across the board at Victor, at the photograph on the wall, facing the right way, at the open box on the counter with the medals visible. "You're different," he said. "You said that before," Victor said. "I said it before, and you said you were just older." Marcus studied him. "That's not what I see now." Victor looked at the board. He was playing black. He could see 4 moves to checkmate. He considered the board for a moment, the full shape of it, every piece in its position, and then made his opening move, not toward checkmate, a developing move, a patient move. He had time. "I'm back," he said. Marcus smiled slowly, the smile of a man whose prayers tend to get answered on their own schedule. He moved his pawn. They played for 2 hours, unhurried, the coffee warm, the oaks moving softly outside. And when Marcus finally saw the checkmate coming and leaned back in his chair with a philosophical expression, Victor took it, clean and direct and without apology. Marcus looked at the board. Then he laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded. "4 moves," he said. "You've been sitting on that for an hour." "I wanted to make sure," Victor said. "Of what?" Victor picked up his coffee. "That I was ready to finish it." Dustin Reeves told his story to a journalist friend from his hometown, and the story ran first in a small regional paper, and then everywhere, the way stories run when they contain something people recognize as true. Not because of the drama, though. There was drama. Because of the cranes. Because of the image of a man spending 17 years watching a hospital breathe from the inside, keeping himself close to the work that had been taken from him, folding paper birds for soldiers who had no visitors. Victor read the article on his phone in the hospital cafeteria. He was eating lunch, an actual lunch at an actual hour, the way people with normal schedules ate, and he read it with the same expression he brought to everything, which was quiet and attentive and gave nothing away. Then he put his phone down and finished his sandwich. Loretta Banks dropped into the seat across from him. She looked at his face. She said, "You're famous." "I was trying to be invisible." "Honey," she said with the weary affection of someone who had worked in a hospital for 23 years and had heard every kind of foolishness, "you were the most visible person in this building. We just let you think otherwise." He looked at her. She looked back without blinking. Then he picked up his phone again, or looked at the article one more time, at the photograph someone had taken of 17 paper cranes arranged on a hospital windowsill, catching the light, and put it in his pocket. "I have a 1 o'clock, he said. "Go on then," Loretta said. "Doctor." He stood. He picked up his tray. He walked out of the cafeteria and down the corridor toward the surgical suite. past the elevator and the supply closet and the mopping cart that belonged to someone else now, and he did not stop to look at any of it. He had looked at it enough. The morning light came through the corridor windows in long, flat bands. Ahead of him, the surgical suite doors were lit from inside. He pushed through them and let the doors close behind him and went to work. If the system that was supposed to protect Victor spent 17 years destroying him instead, how many others are out there still mopping floors, still waiting for the world to see what was taken from them? If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. We have more stories just like this one waiting for you.